This episode of the Big Seance podcast is sponsored by Nuwati Herbals, herbal remedies from Mother Earth. Visit nuwatiherbals.com and use code BIGSEANCE, all one word, to receive 15% off your Nuwati Herbals order as a thank you. Again, that's nuwatiherbals.com, and Nuwati is Nuwati. So what tea will your host be pouring today? Find out a little later. And here's what's coming up in episode 143, August Goforth.
So he continued to physically manifest, I'll just put it out there, privately with me, and once in broad daylight on the subway here in New York City. And he came to me one day and he just said, "How would you like to write a book?" I stupidly said, "Sure," not knowing what I was getting into. And what really was going on were there were thousands, if not tens of thousands of people in spirit who were very interested in the relationship that he and I had, that somehow we were having this kind of interdimensional relationship still going. And they were very interested in the science and the process and the energies in that. And so they thought that they would like to try this experiment to see, could they transmit information? They liked the way that my brain worked, that I was a multiple disciplinary, overeducated kind of person like Tim, and we resonated very well. So they wanted to see if this would work, and indeed it did.
Welcome to the Big Seance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance.
You know what I'm doing? I'm enjoying my summer, y'all. Yep, it's finally here. And for now, I'm enjoying this spring weather before it gets too hot here in Missouri. My husband and I just got back from a nice dinner on a patio in the shade. And before that, we saw the Aretha Franklin documentary called Amazing Grace. It has nothing to do with the paranormal, really, but I totally recommend it if you're a music lover. It's a great snapshot of history and an iconic performance in 1972. It's not a wide release, so you'll have to go Google it and find a theater near you. Before we get to the interview, I want to tell you what I'm drinking. You might remember that last time we were together, I was drinking Walk-In Balance tea. But tonight, I just poured a cup of the Storyteller Tea by Nuwati Herbals. It's for memory and focus, and I need all of that I can get. It contains ginkgo, bacopa, eleuthero, ashwagandha, which I think is my new favorite word, soy protein, ginseng, and other ingredients. And I have to be honest, you guys, I was never a big fan of herbal tea until Nuwati. And now I've been drinking it almost every night. And I've even replaced some of my evening coffee with tea. And that's big for me. It's totally my new thing. Help me thank Nuwati Herbals for sponsoring this show by visiting nuwatiherbals.com. And don't forget that you can get 15% off your order if you use the code BIGSEANCE, all one word. Thanks, Nuwati Herbals. Don't forget to pour your own tea, because here's my interview with August Goforth. August Goforth, a licensed psychotherapist in private practice in New York City, is also a spirit medium. He intentionally does not utilize his mediumistic abilities for psychotherapy sessions, nor does he work as a professional medium to give readings. This is an ethical as well as a personal spiritual choice, and thus utilizes this nom de plume as advised by the Risen. Along with Timothy Gray, he currently sits in a physical mediumship circle for the development of spirit portals to otherwheres. August is co-author of The Risen, Dialogues of Love, Grief, and Survival Beyond Death. His articles have been published in Paranthropology Journal of Exceptional Experiences in Psychology, Paranormal Review, The Searchlight, and the Zerden Buzz Sheet. He has been interviewed on many radio shows and podcasts, including George Norrie's Coast to Coast Radio, Signs of Life Radio, Inner Talk Radio, and Seek Reality. August and Tim were interviewed by the renowned journalist Scott Podmore, featuring them in a chapter in his book, Conversations with Mediums. August is an accredited medium under the auspices of the American Society for Standards in Mediumship and Physical Investigation. Timothy Gray was a writer, editor, photographer, and all-about gadabout in New York City until relocating to his present risen existence in the early 1990s. He became keenly active in meditation and the development of spiritual sensing abilities in the final 2 years of his material existence on Earth. His final terrestrial project was the co-authorship of Dreams, Symbols, and Psychic Power with Dr. Alex Tanis, the noted psychic and parapsychologist. He has been intimately involved with the transmission of much of the Risen Collective's efforts and continues to interact with his Risen team members who have been specifically involved with this book's physical manifestation on Earth. Tim is a co-author of The Risen, Dialogues of Love, Grief, and Survival Beyond Death, which we'll be talking about tonight. Welcome to the Parlor, August.
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.
It's nice to finally hear your voice. I've known of August and this book, The Risen, for years now. In fact, August reached out to me when I was just dipping my foot in the world of the paranormal when I started blogging and investigating. And the content and the concepts at the time were on such a different level. And I joked with August just before this interview that in the world of spirit, he's like post-grad and I'm in third grade just hoping to not get retained another year. So I've always known this interview was going to happen. I just had to be ready for it. And I feel like I'm finally brave enough. So I had to take my time through the book, but I had August there in my messenger to help me through it, which is cool to have the author there by your side as you read their book. I also know there are primary level listeners out there who appreciate when I need things to be broken down a bit. One of the things I love is that in both The Risen and A Companion to Grief, August includes this passage many times throughout, and it says, "These words may not make conscious sense at this time, but my spiritual senses comprehend and retain this knowledge for authentic self." I want you to know that I read that slowly every time and sometimes twice, and I hope it worked. And I know my esoteric queen, Karen A. Dahlman, is hearing this now and giggling over there in the corner. Were you given the idea by the beings you were communicating with to add that message?
Yes.
Is that because they knew it was going to be deep for some of us?
Very deep and overwhelming, and that for all kinds of reasons, which are explained in great detail in the book, that the brain will sort of switch off if it feels overwhelmed by too much information too quickly. And so it's meant to sort of take a deep mental breath or a deep emotional breath. And then later on in the second book about grief, we actually add take a deep breath after it as well too, because I realized that some people actually stop breathing while they're trying to process what they just read. And so sometimes we need a reminder, just, chill out, take a deep breath, take your time, don't rush, because often people are very excited about books like this. There's so many exciting books out there, and then we kind of rush through them because we want to gobble it up right away.
Right.
And this is sort of trying to slow people down. And it's pretty good at that because it is very dense, multidimensional material. A friend of mine who's very familiar with the material, who actually sits in my physical mediumship circle, describes their experience as it's like looking at those topographical maps that you see where there's different, you can see the mountains and the valleys, and they sort of have it. You can see the depth looking at a map. She says that's what she sees clairvoyantly, like the material seems to look like a topographical map to her. And indeed, in the second book about grief, it lets people know that it suggests just take what you need and leave the rest. Don't try to understand it all or take it all in. And people who are in very, very deep grief experiences, whatever that means, often are so sensitive that they have what they can sort of sense we call the infrared information that normally the eye can't see. And they can hear the ultrasounds, the ultrasonar kind of information that's going on that we can't normally hear. So there's a lot of depth to this stuff. And so this particular phrase about we tend to judge ourselves, I don't get this, or I must be stupid, or I'll never get past the third grade. To just sort of be very kind to ourselves and say, it's okay, I've gotten this far, I can go back and reread it, I can put it down. So that's exactly why that was put there, is to sort of slow people down, to give pause.
And when you talked about adding the take a breath part, it very much reminds me of, even throughout the day, normally my smartwatch, which I have very little understanding of what it's doing, but occasionally, as I'm either gritting my teeth or making a zillion decisions every 60 seconds with middle schoolers, my watch will buzz and I'll look down and it says, take a deep breath. And I'm like, well, how did you know I needed to do that? Thank you.
Well, also it introduces the idea, when it says worry not, it's basically saying that even though you're not consciously understanding the information that you just took in with your eyes, there are aspects of yourself that do understand and are taking in the deeper aspects that people might call the subconscious or even the unconscious, that this is sinking in very slowly. And you may not be consciously aware of it, but rest assured that you're taking it all in some kind of a way. So it's really promoting the idea of chilling out and relaxing and not get all uptight about it.
So you co-wrote this book with Timothy Gray, a book that I believe was written over a span of 8 years, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
And can you, first of all, I'm sure plenty of people listening to this know about you and your book because it's been kind of out in our circles for a while now. But can you go ahead and introduce us to Timothy Gray?
So Tim is here with me now. He was my, I guess today we would say we were spouses. We were together for a short time on the earth, and each developing in our own way. We had no interest in mediumship then, per se. I was pursuing studies in clinical psychology at a university here, and he was pursuing his job. He was an editor and a photographer, and he edited all kinds of books for people. He was very, very brilliant at that. And then he transitioned very quickly after getting AIDS, and then sort of vanished for a couple years from my life, and then one day physically manifested in my presence after I had processed some very important things that I had to learn some life lessons and grow up in certain ways. And when I did that, it seemed to clear out whatever the blockage was, and he showed up. And from there, I wasn't really talking to anybody about it, and it was a very private thing until So he continued to physically manifest, I'll just put it out there, privately with me. And once in broad daylight on the subway here in New York City. And he came to me one day and he just said, how would you like to write a book? And I stupidly said, sure. And not knowing what I was getting into. And what really was going on where there were thousands, if not tens of thousands of people in spirit who were very interested in the relationship that he and I had, that somehow we were having this kind of interdimensional relationship still going. And they were very interested in the science and the process and the energies and in that. And so they thought that they would like to try this experiment to see, could they transmit information. They liked the way that my brain worked, that I was a multiple disciplinary, overeducated kind of person like Tim, and we resonated very well. So they wanted to see if this would work, and indeed it did. So we say the book was co-authored by Tim and myself, but really there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people who were contributing to it from many disciplines of science, of art, of drama, of education, of medicine, of all kinds of healing sciences and arts from the other side were contributing to this. And that's why it took so long, because they were trying to channel, which isn't quite the right word, but to filter or transmit. I guess that's right. They were transmitting this information, and I was able to discern it. And because I have a very good command of the English language, and Tim did too, and he was an editor, all these things were synchronistically linking up together in such a way that they could utilize Tim as a conduit towards me and some of my own spirit guides as conduits. And then Tim was utilizing other people, and other people were using other people. It's sort of this, what we call a mediumistic pony express going on the other side. And information that you might call of higher vibration or wisdom, if I can use that word, took especially a long time to get down through the kind of resistance that material language offers or puts up against any kind of spiritual language. Because where Tim is, they don't speak in the way that we speak. They use language, if you want to call that, in a very different way. So this is like, interpreting something from Russian into Italian into Chinese and all the way down into English, and then to come out. And I've been working on a project with a dream of people around the world have asked me, like, could you get this translated into our language? And we've tried, but it's not going too well. Just a lot of it doesn't seem translatable in a way. So there is another project that I've agreed to do an audible book of both of them. How long that's going to take, I don't know, but perhaps the sound waves of my voice probably will carry a lot of information to people, even if English isn't their first language. I found that to be true in some of the countries that I've gone around in and talked to about it.
Well, I would love to know if you think the collaboration with you and Tim and the other Risen, this group that was with Tim, do you think that this was due to the bond and connection that you had with Tim, or is it more a larger purpose that, came from this group with Tim?
Both. Yeah. Right. It's just that whatever we would call the bond, the connection that Tim and I had and still have was very unique. And so many aspects of his psychological and spiritual makeup and mind, it was just like scientists who discover, the conditions are just perfect for this experiment. And somehow all these conditions were lining up, and they did a lot of orchestration too, lining up things and helping us clean up our act and get some of the static out of the way. So for me, it was like a great experiment. It stopped and it started. I kind of burnt out after 2 or 3 years, because this really required me to be in a kind of altered state of consciousness almost 24/7, which apparently I was to begin with. And so that helped an awful lot. And Tim was as well too. So it's just that the conditions were right. And the more, so this was like a great experiment to see, can we get this information in about quantum physics? Can we get in this information about the way water affects human psychology? And they were just trying, and they were just, the books are just like these, to me, these brilliant interweavings of many, many, many minds. And it was invigorating and exhausting at the same time. The first book was, took about 8 years of almost daily continuing, just even when I wasn't sitting at the keyboard of the computer tapping this stuff out, it was coming to me when I was riding on the subway. It was coming to me when I was going for a jog. It was coming to me at 3:00 in the morning. And so I learned how to retain it and store it in a special place of my mind so that I could come back and access it when I actually was in front of a keyboard. Sometimes I would just have scraps of paper that the thought would come to me and I would write it. Or if I didn't have paper, I'd have to memorize it and try to bring it back. And they taught me how to, it was something that we called an infosphere, which meant that it was all this incredible amount of information densely packed into a very, what we would discern as a small space. And it was programmed to be accessed by me. And so they would hand me these infospheres. And when I accessed it wherever I was, all this information would just start pouring out through me. And then I could stop it if I needed to go eat or go sleep or something like that. And then I could come back and pick up from where it was on. So it was a very involved kind of project. When the first book was done, I had no idea how I would know it was done, but somehow I did. It's sort of the way an artist has to know when they put their signature on a painting. But this is very different because there were many signatures. The most interesting thing happened to me. Many interesting things happens, but the most fascinating thing was they said, okay, now we've been doing this for 7 or 8 years and we're just about done and the book is ready to go to press. And there's just one more person or entity or spirit that is very far away and has been traveling to come do this next thing. It's taken them light years to get here, and we've been preparing the way for them. We're very excited about whoever this is, and they're going to come and they're going to just add one little thing to this book, and then it will be done. They can't stay very long because they can't withstand the kind of lower pressures of our environment, much less your environment. So it's sort of this make way for this person to come in. And all they did was they said, okay, go to page such and such, go to the paragraph on that page, go to this particular sentence in that page, and you're going to see 2 words close to each other. And I want you to switch those words. And the sentence made perfect sense the way it was. But when I switched those 2 words, the entire book, it was like dominoes just fell into place. It was just like lit up. It was amazing that those 2 words made such a difference. And then it was done.
I remember you saying that when you were deep into this process, it was just so, well, you've said today too, it was just so kind of tiring and tedious. Did you ever try to learn to shut it off when you needed to, or was it not possible, or did you just always roll with it?
I tried all of the above. And so there came a point where just life circumstances were so demanding at that time. And the book had already been in process for 3 or 4 years. And I just said to them, you know what? I'm burnt out on this. I need a break. And they said, sure. So they shut down the project for about a year. And I totally forgot about it and just did some other things, which like included I had to do just some extra educational things for a lot of my clinical degree and writing papers. And I have specializations in my field that I had to attend to and do all that. So they gave me, so it's like a year and a half of just completely, it felt like I abandoned it, but I didn't. It was just sort of put on pause, which turned out to be a good thing, because then when I came back, they had, whoever they are, including Tim, had been working anyway. And they said, guess what? We have restructured this entire thing. And so now we're just going to have you make some changes in terms of the structure, they were calling it. Very much in the way that that one entity asked me to switch the words. They said, we're going to have you switch things around. It was like editing. It was like this spiritual editing. And suddenly then it all fell into place. Like the book just unfolded organically. It was a very beautiful thing to watch, and I had to hardly do anything. I just had to fill in the blanks. So, but I learned how to, I don't know if compartmentalize is the right word. It's sort of like you're aware that there's background noise or background music going on, and that I can just turn it up and listen to it whenever I want to. There were instances where some of the information that was coming through couldn't be repeated. And I learned how to recognize those particular instances where if it meant they had to wake me up at 3:30 in the morning and I had to get up out of bed and go sit down and try to just write out a few sentences, then I would do that. So there's a lot. I'm not sure if I would call it sacrifice, but there was a lot of work involved in that.
I would love if you could go into in more depth about these infospheres, because first of all, I would love for all of us, the rest of us, to have access to some of those. And could you like describe kind of like, how did you know an infosphere was coming? What was the experience like of receiving it? And, you know, is it a rush? Like, I just can't imagine.
Well, can you tell me what it is that you can imagine? Like, what is it? What are you imagining, or what?
Oh gosh, like first of all, I'm envisioning this very Glenda the Good Witch, Wizard of Oz bubble with this sparkling knowledge inside that's not interpretable while I'm looking at it, and then somehow it's just downloaded, I guess, in me. That's what I'm imagining.
That's pretty good. So, you know, everything is vibrating. The universe, it's all based on vibration. And we could really get very deeply into that, like, because very few people actually ask or demand to have the question answered, like, well, what's vibration? What does that mean? Because you just see the word vibration used everywhere, very kind of slapdashedly, but no one actually, including scientists, are kind of afraid to say, but just what is vibration? What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
But vibration is a way of containing information, transmitting information, altering information, growing information, evolving information. It's it's life itself. And so these infospheres that I'm calling them, for lack of a better word, are living as well. So it's intelligence as well. It's active as well. And so some people may, in the way that our senses interpret certain vibrations in visual ways, or in ways that we hear things, or a way that we smell things, infospheres activate what I would call our spiritual senses that don't exclude the physical senses, because we might experience the sense of touch or smell or something when we're activating and interacting with an infosphere, but it also activates and interacts with the deeper spiritual senses, which in many people I find their spiritual senses are latent, meaning they're inactive or they're not really developed, but they can develop very, very quickly. So a person might interact with this knowledge. It may come to them in a ball of light, or it may come to them as a ball of inner light that they see, or they may actually see it as an outer light. I think the great psychoanalyst Carl Jung was anticipating infospheres in his research. He did an entire book on UFOs. And I don't know if he would agree with me or not, but it seemed like he was discussing infospheres that people were seeing and are experiencing, that we're calling unidentified flying objects, whatever that is. And you think about UFOs, you know, there are these craft that move and transmit information and energy and very intelligent and come and go very, very quickly. And some people can see them and some people can't. And some people are afraid of them and some people aren't. So for me, during the book, so I'm not saying that I was channeling information. I'm saying I was discerning and then interpreting it. And sometimes it took a very long time, a lot of effort to interpret just a little bit of information. And after 8, 9, 10 years of this, somehow I was able to, they were able to give me not just pieces of information, but great big bundles of information that we called infospheres. And so it was sort of like passing it around like a hot potato. Here, you take it. No, you take it. No, you take it. And as I became more intimately involved with this method of communication, I began to understand that this was getting close to understanding how the people I call the risen people in spirit, how they communicate. They communicate with these balls. We would maybe see them as balls of light. Others might experience them as balls of sound or music in that kind of a way. But for basic purposes of me being in this material physical body on the terrestrial plane of Earth, that this was an infosphere that was interacting with my psychology and interacting with my emotional sense of being, with my awareness. So the more aware that I became of my own self, the more aware I was becoming of information, which exists everywhere all at once, but it can also be shaped and formed and compacted into these, I won't call them objects, these somethings that we were just calling infospheres.
So it's quite possible that I had an overly Disney imagined version of infosphere in my head.
Which would not be wrong. I mean, that's probably how Disney got most of his information.
Wow, yeah. So Tim manifested for you on a few occasions, and you've talked about that already briefly. I have my own experience that I'd like to ask you about, but I first wanted to ask if you'd share at least like the first manifestation with us.
Sure. I was sitting in my apartment exactly where I'm sitting right now, which is my kind of my den and my bedroom. And so there's a bed there, a really big bed, and there's cats sleeping on it right now. And I don't know what I was doing at the time. I was doing something on the computer, and you know how in your physical eyes, the peripheral vision is very sensitive, like it's the most sensitive part. So people often see things out of the corner of their eye that they normally wouldn't see looking directly at something. It's like that sensitive area. And so I saw something and turned, and this was 2 years after he had died. Tim was sitting there on the bed with this huge cat that ate the canary smile on his face, wearing a red flannel shirt, and he was dressed in jeans, and he was just looking like he always looked, and he was just sitting there on the bed. And I wasn't scared, but it startled me so much because there was no warning or no noise or no funny smells or anything. It was just like someone had switched it on. And I yelled out and stood up real quickly, and all these books, I have thousands of books all over, all these books just went flying all over the place. And then he was gone. And I kind of was shocked in a way. It jarred. Over the next few days, I sort of wandered around kind of in shock and not knowing, like, I wasn't questioning my sanity. I didn't know what the question was, but it did start triggering memories that I had suppressed to some degree, that this had been gone. I had these same kind of experiences as a child. And my family had known it, and my parents had known this, and my grandparents had known this. Both my grandmothers were mediums, but it was kind of a family secret. And I was able to speak to some relatives, and they confirmed all this. Yeah, that's what's happening. They didn't call it a physical medium, but they said, yeah, there were always people in spirit who were always around you in all kinds of ways. So that was sort of like his entry into this world, and he had prepared for it and he had studied for it. It's not an easy thing to do. If it was easy, a lot more people would be doing it, obviously. But I kept that to myself, and then I shared about it, which is important for people to do because we tend to need validation. So I shared about this experience with a trusted person, and they demonstrated exactly what I needed was just an openness, a curiosity, a lack of fear, a lack of judgment, a lack of stigmatization, but just saying, wow, that is really amazing. I'm glad you had that experience. And so that's what kind of helped build the foundation. Often later, now years and years later, I know, so I can state this with my own authority, that we all have these experiences quite a bit. But there is this aspect of human psychology where, so there's a difference between phenomenon. So a phenomenon or phenomena are things that happen, like it rains, that's a phenomenon. A book falls on the floor, that's a phenomenon. A flashlight gives off light, that's a phenomenon. As opposed to something called a noumenon, which is a spiritual event that exists otherwhere. You know that word otherwhere we were using?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Yeah. So phenomenon belong here in our physical world, and noumenon, the numinous, belong otherwhere, elsewhere. And every once in a while, in fact, quite a bit, here and otherwhere merge. Some of our terrestrial reality merges into other dimensions, and some of the reality aspects of other dimensions emerge into our physical dimension. But there's something, it happens a lot to us every day, but there's this kind of quirky aspect of human psychology that's probably linked to survival instinct. When something creepy or spooky or scary happens, we immediately switch off to it. It's kind of like there's certain animals that go into stasis when they're scared. They kind of faint and they look dead. It's kind of like we do that when we are confronted with something so numinous that it just does not fit into this physical world, but here it is. Our brains switch off. And I developed a term called psychospiritual amnesia. And it's like an amnesia. And so very slowly since that incident, I realized it was happening a lot. It had been happening a lot, but I was just forgetting it. And I've trained myself to recognize when it's about to happen and when it happens and how to prolong it and how to retain it and how to maintain it or sustain it to a degree. And probably a lot of people understand what I'm talking about. This is just my quirky way of saying it. But I'm just saying that it doesn't make me special, all that special or different. I think we all have this ability, and we talk about that in these books, that everyone has these abilities to experience more and more numinous stuff along with the phenomenal stuff that we experience as part of life. We're much bigger and more infinite than we realize if we want to realize that.
Well, and that might be true, but on a few occasions, things merged, as you were saying so perfectly, that you also experienced touch along with the manifestation, right?
Right. Yeah. So that's that interpretation of vibration.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if it's a very good example, but someone might see clairvoyantly or see a ghost or what they would call a spirit or something, and they're just seeing it. Other people there might also be hearing it.
Mm.
And other people might also be feeling it. It might even be able to touch them. They might feel touched by it in some kind of a way. So it depends upon these sensing mechanisms or whatever you want to call them, how developed they are, sensitive they are, or if they're plugged in some kind of way, whether we're actually able to have an enhanced experience of whatever is going on. And for some, it's very limited, and for others, it's less limited. And to me, those seem like abilities that can be explored and experimented with and stretched and grown, not necessarily easily, but it is possible.
The question that I was going to ask you came to my mind after reading about you explaining one of these manifestations of Tim and experiencing touch with Tim and the questions that kind of went in your head the first time this happened. And I first of all have to explain that I don't have a ton of close people in my life who I have lost. I kind of have a young family. And so, one of these days that's going to hit me hard. But there was an evening, I want to say 6-7 years ago, where I woke up in the middle of the night and my partner's on the other side sleeping. And I just felt a presence. And this is something I've had very few phenomena like this happening on as far as the paranormal goes, even though I've searched for it for a long time. But it was like a chill in the air, and I could tell someone or something was there. And I'm fairly confident that I was awake. And I was a little frightened just because I was not sure what was going on. And listeners have heard me tell this story once or twice. But as I lied there on my side, facing my partner, so I'm on the right side of the bed and I'm on my left side, suddenly I was grabbed and kind of pulled over back to my back by a hand that came over from the side of the bed. And I think intuitively or in my mind's eye or something, I imagined that this was a really, like the movies, bony, dark, cold hand. And it just kind of retreated. And I remember I reached for it quickly and felt it, and then it retreated. And so I've never been one to believe in demons and all those Hollywood versions of negative spirits and energy. But I had been doing some seances that week. And I had also, at the time, I was doing some investigations and I was helping a family out with some stuff going on in their home. And so I kind of just assumed that even though it had never happened to me before, and I always rolled my eyes at people talking about hitchhikers and taking energy home with them, I kind of assumed it was that. But the thoughts going on in your mind when you had your experience were so similar to mine. And so I was like, well, I don't know. How do I know it wasn't something that was not harmful or someone I know trying to communicate? And they're like, hey, man, that really freaked him out. I think I'm going to peace out. Like, how do I know it? I've never wanted to just jump to, because people will tell me, as soon as they hear that story, they're like, oh yeah, you had a demon, or, oh yeah, you brought something home. But how do I know? Maybe it wasn't.
Well, by how it felt emotionally, our feelings never lie to us. So I'm not talking about like the feeling of someone tickling us or the wind or something going against our skin. I mean, our emotional feelings always tell us the truth. Our minds lie to us all the time. They omit things and fill in the gaps and twist things around and try to tell a different story. And we've been taught, most of our educational system, at least in the Western world, we've been taught to place less and less emphasis on our feelings and more emphasis on our thinking. So that kind of experience was essentially a very feeling experience. It was tangible in many ways, not just physically, but emotionally. And for those few seconds, or whether it was, timeful or timeless moments, the mind was kind of disabled. You were having like a pure interchange of the numinous with the phenomenal, and the mind was disabled from that. But then as soon as the mind kind of comes to and kicks in, then it starts sort of judging and trying to rationalize things. And then it what I call the ego mind starts making suggestions about fear, like, oh, that must be a demon, or remember that sermon you heard years ago. And so then we get carried away by all this stuff. And that kind of interruption interferes with whatever is going on. Like it won't completely finish itself. So it's like seeing something in partial bloom that sort of doesn't look very pretty yet, and it's still unfolding, it's still manifesting. And it's like seeing a skeleton, an ectoplasm manifest out of that into a hand, into a person. But in the beginning, it's not very pretty. So, the process can get interrupted in that way. And some people have that experience. Others may have, like where Tim was able to manifest completely fully, but he also did manifest several times not completely or fully, where only like the upper half of him manifested, where I would wake up in his embrace and I could feel him from the waist up, but there was nothing from the waist down. And I could see how that was kind of startling me. Not scaring me, because I knew better than to be scared, but it was kind of gross or creepy. And he also had the same experiences, because his being able to manifest physically was not an easy thing to do. And so he struggled with it as well. And there were a couple times where he was physically manifesting and he would kind of get startled or maybe even scared. And then it would sort of like the experiment would kind of go awry in some kind of way, and things, nothing bad or dangerous would happen. But then it's what happens afterwards with our mind, if our mind gets a hold of it, and where we tell other people and then their minds get a hold of it and they start misinterpreting it in ways that aren't really helpful or useful to us, because it really is the most loving energy that we can imagine, that's really trying to manifest itself into our lives when those things happen. Even though it may not look like love, it is love.
August, you received a really comforting message that touched me, and this came from a higher being about the decision to end one's life and the fact that there is no judgment. And I wrote you about this right after I read this section, because I was very comforted by this message. And what was most comforting was the assurance of no judgment and taking the pressure off of anyone who has struggled with thoughts of suicide. And it made me jump back to when I lost a colleague years ago to suicide after suffering from cancer. And I still fume when I think of the snotty comments another colleague made when a memorial was donated, and comments like, it is horrible that he's being glorified when he offed himself, or what a failure, and things like that. And I'd never really knew that kind of judgment and feeling existed until then. And then that kind of opened my eyes to what some people feel about it. And I thought that was a really cool message. Can you, I don't know, maybe go into how that came across, or who brought that through and what it meant to you?
Well, I think it was, so of course this whole process was so intimate in terms of being given access to this information and to these higher forms of vibration, triggered a lot of things that were healing for me. And there were like trauma. So we all have trauma that is very complex for most of us as human beings. And the trauma, just in the way that our body was evolved to self-heal, like you cut yourself, and if you leave it alone, it will heal. Our minds were evolved to self-heal, and our spirits, if they've been bruised a little bit or a lot, but we have to sort of lower the resistance and not get in the way of the healing. And sometimes it gets so bad and so dark that we're in such pain and suffering that it's not that we want to die, but we just want the pain to end. And so logically, suicide, or what I call self-exiting, seems like a good idea. And it's not a bad idea. It's just an idea. And so it was, I guess I was recounting in the book, it reminded me of when I had lost an animal companion and a person who was a companion that it threw me into such deep bereavement and deep grief that it seemed the only way I could get out of that hole was to get out of my body, which would be self-exiting. And it wasn't a bad idea at all. Like there was no one judging me on that, but I did a number on myself, worrying like, oh my God, is this a good thing to do or a bad thing to do? Is someone gonna, am I gonna get in trouble? Even though I knew about the non-judgmental love of our creator source, that it wouldn't matter to that energy, it was some unresolved psychological issue that I had. So I sort of posed this to the Risen Assembly, and they first sent the person who was one of my grandfathers that I had never met, who he had died, and he was a coal miner. He died very young. And he actually became one of my guides after I was born. And they sent him to sort of just calm me down. It wasn't that I was about to do anything stupid, but I was just really getting into such a painful place of thinking. I was getting very twisted and knotted up. And so they sent him to kind of soothe me. And then he said, and now we're going to bring someone. He said, I'm not even sure I know how to articulate what you need to hear. So here's someone who's much wiser than I. He brought through this higher spirit. And so this particular chapter is called Grief Evolved and Self-Exiting. And so two topics that don't seem related, but they are related, that the energy of grief can be transformed into something higher. And that's what the spirit wanted to talk about, and saying, like, if you choose to self-exit, no big deal. Nobody really cares in ways that are it's not a harmful thing to do. That if you do self-exit and you're still going to arrive on the other side, and you're still going to be hugged, and you're still going to be held, and you're still going to be loved. You're not going to be reviled or put away in some kind of where that doesn't make any sense. This is a universe based on harmony and life, not on all these other dark things that we're capable of imagining.
Or forced to do it all over again.
Or forced to do, yeah. So it's just sort of like you see in all the ancient texts, religious and spiritual texts, there's always some enlightened being showing up that's saying, fear not, worry not, chill out, because we tend to get scared so easily. So the idea, say that person who made a snarky comment about someone who was suffering very much, it was a pretty non-compassionate stance to take about this person, that they were really voicing their own fears that were very deep down in some kind of a way and not realizing it. So, any kind of what we would call a negative comment or a negative stance is really the result of fear. And until we come to the realization, which is what this being was saying in this chapter, to not treat fear as something real. If you treat it as real, then you're going to have an experience that seems real. If you just don't be afraid, you're not going to have a fearful experience. So it's kind of up to us as creators of our lives and our experience about what kind of experience we want to have. And that includes how we choose to move from form to form, from existence to existence, from life everlasting moving forward. Sooner or later, we're going to wear out this body in some kind of a way, most of us anyway, and move on in some way. And how we choose to do it is totally up to us, because we're in charge of our own lives. There's no one there who's judging us. And even, I guess, we're our worst judge, right? If there's anyone who's going to judge, we're going to judge our own selves harshly. And if that's the case, they'll let us judge ourselves until we get tired of it, because these beings on the other side have access to the infinite patience that we're so often desperately looking for. And it's easier for us to have compassion for other people than for ourselves. So they want us to realize that it doesn't matter where you go or how you get there or how you do it. No one is judging you. No one is grading you. it all unfolds perfectly. And that's another phrase that you probably encounter a lot in the book, is to say, my life is unfolding perfectly no matter what. That's a nice thing to remember. I'm glad that it brought you some kind of relief.
Yeah, and I can't explain why. I mean, and I don't ever recall being having suicidal thoughts that are that serious. You know, I don't so I don't know where the comfort came from, or if it's just comforting knowing that if ever there was a time where pain got so bad and it was just like the most miserable thing in the world, that there would be no judgment if it was considered. And I mean, I don't want people freaking out about that. And it's odd to discuss it, but that's it. It really was. It was like, it's kind of, I would compare it to the feeling I had when I first started my journey into reading about all of this stuff and the afterlife and the spirit world, and all of a sudden having it connect after all the dogma I'd been taught and growing up in a religious family, that there was no death, you know, that like there's an afterlife and that was it. And we were all going there, you know, when you learned the truth. And it was kind of that same feeling that I had, you know, it was like, okay, so there's no judgment if that happened. So I kind of, you know, kicked that old dogma out of my head.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Well, so it's a cultural thing, we could say as well too. Every culture has different ideas about life and what they are imagining as death, because it's just an imagine. There should be no, in my opinion, that there should be no such word as death. There just isn't any. It's just an idea. I think it might have been the Course of Miracles, which is a very dense work indeed, that said somewhere in it that the fall from heaven was that sooner or later someone was going to think up the idea of death. And so we did, but we just forgot to laugh about it. And we get way too serious, because life is, I think it says somewhere in the books that life is nothing but light and music. And if you're afraid of light and music, get over it. There's no need to be. And so these books are also introducing like a different kind of culture, what we could call a risen culture. Like, even you arrive over there with these fearful ideas that you're going to be judged, or you did something bad, or you weren't good enough. They're going to kind of laugh at you in a very kind, compassionate, silly way. There's, it's kind of like Glinda the Good Witch laughing at the wicked witch of the West. You have no power here. Be gone before someone drops a house on you. She's just laughing the entire time. It's kind of like that. I like to imagine.
That's nice. I want to get to these. There's two really good questions from listeners, but I also want to kind of have you kind of close up this conversation about the book or both books. And your website, in the description of the Risen Dialogues, you say there are many extreme differences between the risen and the non-risen. And this book was manifested to attempt to introduce ideas, ways, and means to understand and even change some of those differences, to become more entangled with the risen, and to realize how entangled one might already be.
Mm-hmm.
So can you go a little further into that and maybe tell us who this book, or, either the companion to the Risen or the companion, who are these books for? Who might be ready to check these books out if they haven't?
Well, only the person who comes into contact with the material can answer that. So, by the way, the word entangled is being used in kind of the idea that quantum mechanics uses it, or the way that quantum mechanics scientists have appropriated the word entanglement to try to describe much of the indescribable things that they're experiencing. So that's what that is. The books have been described to me by many of the people involved in their creation. And I just have this revalidated again to me this past weekend by a Native American shaman whose the spirits came through and told me this stuff, is that these books were written for the future and not the present, which is very weird because, you know, you write a book or you paint a painting or you make a radio show, it's intended for people in the present, you think, you know, that you want them to hear it now or you want them to read it now. And so, but they were saying some people will find these books or the books will find some people, but these books were really way ahead of their time, for some people by centuries, and that these books are going to be discovered by people long after you've left the earth. But here and there, a few people, for various reasons, will be able to access the material and it will speak to them in certain ways. And that's why the second book was written about grief, because people in deep grief are very open and kind of raw and can absorb a lot of this stuff that they don't necessarily talk about, but the book can help them talk about that. So I don't know if that makes sense. It's kind of weird to think that these books were written for people in the future. And some people who know the material in these books very well, have studied the material in the Risen books very well, have kind of confirmed that they've noticed that a lot of the concepts introduced in the books are kind of weird or alien or contradictory to the current status quo of what's acceptable by various communities. And then they noticed that over the years that it seemed like people were almost plagiarizing the books or just lifting material directly from it into their books and stuff, but they weren't. They were just kind of lagging behind and accessing in some kind of a way. So the books are, I can't think of anyone that the books wouldn't speak to just the littlest bit, whether now in the present or in the future. That's one of the nice things that I like about where it's stated in different ways is it's sort of like 12-step stuff. It is 12-step spiritual programs where they say, take what you need and leave the rest. Progress, not perfection. Those ideas are interwoven. So a lot of people who are in 12-step programs might recognize a lot of material in this book in some way, because it's clear to me that the 12 steps of like AA and NA and stuff were not written by people, but they were transmitted in some kind of way by what we could call the Risen.
And what an honor to be told that your books are really meant for the future. Just,
well, that's a good way to look at it.
About that. Yeah. Well, you are a psychotherapist, as your bio states, and a listener, Christine, would love to know how one goes about finding a therapist who won't call the paddy wagon on you if you talk to them about your prophetic dreams, names you hear when you meditate, or how to develop your psychic gifts.
Oh, yeah. I had the same questions. As a patient as well as a practitioner. And I actually wrote a very, very long professional journal article about that, about the ethics and how mediumship and psychotherapy interact and can interact in our white westernized world, mostly white. And is it appropriate and when is it appropriate for a psychotherapist to refer a patient to a medium and vice versa? I've had mediums refer people to me for psychotherapy because they know who I am. I haven't had I've had a few people in the mental health field who know about me, but it's not really part of the educational system in terms of phenomenon or noumenon in some kind of a way. So it's perfectly understandable that someone would be kind of scared to share with their therapist, I see dead people. But I think that's less and less true now, that because of this weird world of the World Wide Web, of the internet, that you can Google these things. Really, you can actually find therapists who will say, you want to look for a therapist who says, isn't afraid to say on their website or however they're presenting themselves that they embrace it and a certain kind of spirituality, and that they include a certain kind of set of spiritual beliefs in their work.
I was wondering if people tended to be that open enough to put a statement like that.
For the most part, no, but it's starting to happen. There is one therapist I know. So in New York State, therapists have to, in order to maintain the validity of their license, they have to do continuing education credits, which means we're still going to school all the time, which is a really good thing. And that there's this one therapist who's actually starting to teach classes about astral projection and out of body experiences, and linking it up with, all different kinds of what we would call alternate healing. So it's starting to emerge. I totally get where she's saying she's afraid, you're going to get institutionalized if you just say the wrong thing or the right thing. And that's true too. If traditionally, if someone expresses they're thinking of suicide or something like that, that they're just going to lock you up in some kind of a way. So it's becoming less fear-based. So you sort of have to do research. What I would do, as I do for most things, is through my own way of prayer, is I ask the universe to link me up or lead me or orchestrate me towards what, would serve me best, or what therapist would serve me best, or what doctor would serve me best. And you learn how to listen to that. And it seems like people, you will link up with someone. Of course, I'm blessed by living in New York City, which is not the United States. It's its own planet. So we have such great diversity of everything here that almost anything goes, which is very lovely. And I know it's very different if, say, you're a small community in some outlying state where they do things pretty conservatively. So, but you can find this information on the internet. I guess I would just want people to make sure that the person that they're going to see for help is licensed in some kind of a way, that they've done the educational bit and they've done the studies. And I always tell people, be a good consumer. If you're going to go see a therapist, go see several therapists until you want to see if it feels right. That's a self-empowering kind of act of self-authority that is useful to take with any kind of approach, whether you're buying a new car or you're looking for a good doctor.
And you actually kind of touched on this next question from Kenneth. Kenneth says, my question is, how do you, meaning you, August, how do you clinically detach from your mediumship and your clinical treatment of your patients? This is very important for those who are mediums and also in the human services field, be they therapist or social scientist.
Mm-hmm. Boundaries. You have to have boundaries. So it comes under the general term of ethics. So I don't bring my mediumship into my psychotherapy practice, because then it would start making it about me. And the therapy is not about me. It's about the person coming there who is giving me the honor of witnessing what is going on with them and helping them find the way back to alignment and to health. And it's just the way that mediumship is viewed now in our culture. It's more been seen as, sort of a spooky thing or an entertainment thing. It's been kind of contaminated in certain ways, but I can still, so it's like, I'm not going to tell my patient that I'm a medium, because then they're going to want to know all about it. And then I'm going to have to explain them and things. It's sort of like I would have to explain to them, what a therapist is and how I got, it goes on and on and on. So you have to have boundaries in some kind of a way. So that's the clinical detachment, is knowing what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And it's tricky because therapists struggle with how much should they disclose anything about themselves to a patient. Will this be helpful or harmful? And there are clinical guidelines set into place in terms of process and procedure and practice it depends on what kind of a therapist you are, but that you have a sort of someone who kind of you would go for guidance or supervision or advice and run it by them in that kind of a way before you unleash it upon your patient. So it doesn't mean that I'm detached from my mediumship when I'm in session with someone, and pretty much all of my patients who come to me are brought to me or impressed to come to me in the way that maybe someone might find the books or any kind of a book. It's sort of the universe is always tending towards harmonizing things that aren't harmonized, and that includes healing in that kind of a way. So the people who are coming to me probably wouldn't be surprised to know that I'm a medium. And a couple actually figured it out because they're mediums themselves. And so that was kind of a delightful thing. But it takes some restraint, maybe in some people's cases, because it seems kind of cool. Oh, you're a medium. Tell me about it. And suddenly now you're talking about yourself. And you have to, as a therapist, learn that this work is not about you, but it's about the other person. I don't know if that answers the question. It's a complex. I wrote like a huge professional article about this, which actually did not get published in mainstream clinical journals because the article claims to have been co-written by people in spirit, so they weren't going to draw that kind of possibility of stigmatization upon themselves. But the Journal of Paraanthropology and some other journals of parapsychology were happy to publish them.
Are these available to be linked to the show notes of this episode?
They're at the website.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I want listeners to know that whenever it is the right time for you to stumble upon these books, I highly encourage you to check them out. There are several questions that I would have loved to have the opportunity to get to. And like, for example, a cool experience that August went through right after the events of 9/11, which is fascinating. And, some other events and other manifestations of Tim and on the train and some cool stuff. So definitely check out the books. And August's website, if I am not mistaken, is therisenbooks.com, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And I just want to give you the opportunity to, before we part, to, any final thoughts, or if there's anything coming up for you, if you want to mention any social media or any of that.
I sort of have a kind of a global, but a quiet presence amongst many mediumistic communities around the world, and people. I sort of have a bit of a Facebook. I'm not much of a social media person, but people can contact me on Facebook. Occasionally, I publish a few things or post a few things on Instagram. So I was just sort of playing and experimenting with them. Mm-hmm. But I'm not a Twitter or a tweeter in that. But people can contact me through the website. They can email me. I get a fair amount of emails from people, and I answer them all. I love interacting with people. So I'm not inaccessible. I'm not that famous, so they don't have to worry. There's no one going to keep them from getting to me. I have my own physical mediumship circle that I sit for, what's called Development, here in New York City. It's private. It's closed right now. It's not open to anyone other than the few people who are sitting there. But yeah, certainly people can contact me, and I'll do my best to return the compliment. I guess the only, the parting words, which are meant to go on, is someone, they're always asking me for advice or guidance. And my advice is chill out, relax, calm down. Don't take things so personally or seriously. Find reasons to laugh. I was recently at a very intense Native American healing ceremony these past few days. It took almost 2 years for this to happen, but it did. And so there were spirits. It's a healing ceremony, but there are spirits who materialized in the darkness during these ceremonies. And there was this one spirit, Itomizi, which means yellow spider in the language of these native peoples. And Itomizi materialized as a person and came up to me and held my head in her hands. And she just leaned forward and she whispered into my ear, "Be happy." And in those 2 words, everything changed. Like it's just the thrust and the meaning and the dimensions of meaning in those 2 words, "be happy," just soaked through me. And I wish that I could somehow relay that to everyone listening. Is just be happy. It's a choice. I often ask my patients, I said, okay, would you choose fear or would you choose to be happy? And they always say, well, I would choose to be happy. And so, okay, so you just did it. It's a conscious choice. But we forget that we have a conscious choice to be happy in that. So those are my final words. It's just be happy.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Well, I'm glad we finally did this. You rock, August Goforth.
Thank you.
Thank you to the following super Paranerds who support the show at patreon.com/Big Seance. Genesis, Diana Lloyd, Natalie, Sonia B, Kim Robb, Jim Budd, Josiel Lorenzo, Susan Davey, Paula Mitchell, and Amy Park Gedicke. My supporters at the Parlor guest level, who can be found at bigseance.com/Parlor guests, are Linda of shimmeringmoons.com, Denise Sia of Mystic Moms Paranormal, Joni Kuntz, Sylvie, Jeffrey Peck, Dina DeCastro of Dina DeCastro Astrology, Peggy Hagen, Sharon Bowles, Marion Hover, Clairvoyant, Bruce Williams, Christopher Kohler, Lena and John of Carbon Lilies, Anna Frias, Norman and Linda Keller, and Karen Prine. That sound you just heard was the above and beyond there's not even a category for your level of support fireworks display. Because I have an awesome listener, Jackie Pacheco, who supports the show at the $10 level. Thank you, Jackie. And thank you, Paranerds.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. You can find and subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and just about anywhere podcasts are found. Do you have any comments or feedback? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how to get your voice in a future show. Or you can call my feedback line, 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. Interested in learning how to promote and share the podcast? Go to bigseance.com/share. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.